Hola, muy buenas. Muchas gracias por venir, sobre todo a aquellos que no conocemos. Veo unas caras nuevas, es siempre un placer tener gente nueva. Y también lo que conocemos, obviamente. Y lo siento para aquellos que os conocéis, pero tenemos que hacer un pequeño resumen. Lo voy a hacer en español porque de todas formas Ana lo entiende un poco y luego ella va a hablar en inglés. Pero bueno, agradecemos a la Virreina porque es la primera vez que hacemos una actividad con ellos y en particular este proyecto que es el final proyecto del Bartul, que es nuestro programa de formación práctica de 9 meses en artes visuales y non también. Y Bar Project es una organización no profit que desde el 2013 realiza un programa de residencia para artistas comisarios y todo esto, para decirlo muy rápidamente, empezó porque analizamos, Andrea, que no está presente, Juan y yo, que para nosotros, según nosotros, faltaba, digamos, unas cuantas cosas en Barcelona a nivel de propuesta artística cultural. Por ejemplo, mucha conexión con lo afuera, bueno, con gente viniera aquí y tal. Entonces decidimos invitar a gente y desarrollar este programa de residencia, tanto con artistas y comisarios. Y bueno, lo vamos haciendo desde el 2013. Y como se nos fuera bastante, decidimos también de añadir un programa de formación, porque a raíz de toda la gente que hemos traído, muchas muy interesantes, pensamos que hubiera sido importante aprovechar, digamos, de esas personalidades y también de dar lugar un poco más a las temáticas que nos interesaban. Y entonces hemos empezado en el 2016 este programa de formación práctica junto con la Fundación Tapias, donde somos también el proyecto residente, y la Fabra Coats, donde tenemos los estudios desde el principio. Y esta es la tercera edición y estamos muy orgullosos de nuestros participantes. Y entonces, nada, también este proyecto surgió a raíz de un poco de aprovechar, digamos, de todos estos invitados que hemos traído a Barcelona, pero también porque, según nosotros, falta un poco de actualización de, digamos, en el ámbito de la educación del arte, digamos, falta un poco de actualización en cuanto a metodologías y temáticas, y entonces queremos hacerlo como nosotros lo hacemos, es decir, compartir metodología, prácticas y conocimientos, hacer errores juntos también, pero estar ahí como, bueno, una plataforma de apoyo, como siempre hacemos, y también dar un marco de presentación a los artistas, que son artistas, pueden ser del territorio del Estado o de afuera también. Y entonces proponerle todos estos recursos humanos, profesionales, de equipamiento también, y porque, como sabréis, o porque no lo sabes, nosotros no tenemos un espacio propio, sino vamos utilizando lo que existe ya en la ciudad, que sea ya espacio físico de una institución, pero también la ciudad entendida como ciudad bajo el cielo, quiero decir, el espacio público. Y entonces hemos empezado este proyecto que se llama Bartul, que hace un poco la palabra tool, herramienta, hace un poco eco a la escuela, pero no es una escuela, aunque se parece un poco. Y nada, la gente que seleccionamos, porque a diferencia del programa de residencia, que es un programa de invitación, lo cual nosotros invitamos los tres juntamente, decidimos invitar bueno, comisarios, artistas según las temáticas y los intereses lo que pueden aportar a la ciudad. En este caso, las personas, los participantes aplican a una convocatoria durante, digamos, un año académico pueden ensayar, probar, descubrir, conocer y finalmente presentar el proyecto que han querido producir. Y entonces, los primeros 2 años lo hemos hecho la Fabra Coats, hemos tenido, aparte del centro de producción, hemos podido ocupar el centro de arte, haciendo ahí una exposición final, cosa que no hacemos muy a menudo, porque solemos hacer más actividades de performance o, digamos, de naturaleza más discursivas o performativa. Y por el tercer año volvemos a hacer esto que nosotros hacemos desde el principio, o sea, un programa público, en lo cual los 7 participantes el próximo fin del 29-30 de 6 a 9 podrán mostrar, enseñar lo que han propuesto. Y aquí, en el auditorium, afuera, en la Virreina, obviamente. Y hoy tenemos el placer de contar con un invitado que también hacía parte, digamos, del currículum anual y que, digamos, también es como un encuentro introductorio a este programa del próximo fin de. Y no sé si quiere decir algo o lo introduzco.
Sí, introdúcela.
Y luego después. Porque después también hablaremos de los respectivos proyectos que tenemos un poco en común, digamos, con la curadora. Y Anna Colin, es una curadora de origen francés, pero trabaja mucho entre Londres y París. Desde hace unos años ha empezado esta escuela Open Schoolist, que antes estaba en Londres y ahora está en Margate, en el sur de Inglaterra, y al mismo tiempo también es curadora asociada de la Lafayette Anticipation. Y bueno, ella nos va a contar lo que, digamos, tal vez une un poco todo su proyecto, toda su trayectoria, que es que hace un espacio alternativo que a nosotros nos interesaba porque nos consideramos como proyecto alternativo, digamos, o plataforma alternativa. Y también es su proyecto de tesis, de doctorado. Así que nada, ella va a contar este proyecto de tesis y luego, como siempre, estamos abiertos a la conversación y también un poco conversar sobre estos proyectos de pedagogía curatorial, digamos. Bueno, ya está. Gracias.
Hi everyone. I'm sorry I've not translated my presentation into Spanish. I've only done it once and it was a bit epic, and I thought, because I'm going to talk about my PhD, that's really hard to translate. It's hard to translate into French, which is my language, so I thought everything in English. But first, thank you to Veronica and Juan and Andrea, who is not here, for inviting me today. I had a great afternoon meeting some of the artists. That was a real pleasure, so thank you for the afternoon. And I'm going to talk, as Veronica said, about Open School East first, and that's going to be going through slides, being quite spontaneous and possibly messy, because it's a messy project. The second part of my presentation will be a bit more structured, and I apologize in advance, but I'll be reading a bit because it's full of things to remember and quotes that matter to me. So I'm going to put this on. So just lower this. If you can't hear me, or if you can't understand me, or if I'm too fast, please tell me. So first I'm going to talk about Open School East, which was created in 2013 in London and moved to Margate. So if you trace a line between London and the sea, like a horizontal line, you get to Margate. It's a small seaside town, which is an hour and a half from London. And Open School East is somewhere between a free art school and an artist development program for artists of different generations, and a neighborhood social and art center, or community center, or community art centers, as we would say in England, where a lot of our programs are co-produced with the people we work with, co-decided, and all the activities we do are kind of culturally driven, but they are a lot about social inclusion, and they deal with a lot of subjects that are close to the reality of people living around Open School East, which is regeneration, the housing crisis, and different topics like that. Everything we do is free, and that's quite significant in England. So this is the school. The picture on the left was the first building where we're in East London. The second picture is the second building we were in Margate. And this is the building where we are currently on the left. On the right is where we've got the artist studios. So that's now the artist studio part and the learning and public parts in two separate buildings. The significance of the building on the left, besides being incredibly beautiful, it was built as a school of arts and craft in 1929 and opened in 1931. And it closed in 74, and since then it's been an adult education center. So that comes out of a trajectory of community and adult education, free and accessible to all at either for free or at minimal price. So the initial impetus for starting the school was to respond to a set of situations. So fees for higher education in England were spiraling, and the student debt was equally spiraling. So now it's about £10,000 a year to study for an MA or for a BA in the UK. Contact time with tutors in art schools were shrinking, and administrative duties were squashing their headspace for creative and critical input. Art schools were also becoming more and more market-oriented and promoted a spirit of competition between the artists and the students. And last but not least, in the face of the dismantling of the welfare state and the privatization of public space, free informal spaces for learning, for discovery, for socializing were closing one after the other. In the following year, in the year preceding the opening of Open School East, 300 libraries were closed, countless community centers and other kind of public social spaces were closed. So we were kind of responding to that. And we wanted to institute a space that would provide a range of communities, artistic, local, and otherwise, with a collaborative, versatile, non-exclusive learning environment, as well as a space for practical, social, and intellectual encounters. And we asked ourselves two questions when we started Open School East. What does it mean for artists to train and develop their practice in a setting that is shared with people from varied backgrounds and varied generations? And what would a community center with artists in residence look like in the 21st century? So we did a lot of research rather than being inspired by, of course we were inspired by alternative art education initiatives, and I can cite a few later. What we were mostly interested in is seeing how the community art centers in the 70s, 80s, and 90s had been functioning and really developed this spirit of cooperation, of interest in the locale, in investment in kind of social issues surrounding the space and the location of the building. So now it's been 6 years, and we've just relocated to this school, to this former School of Arts and Craft, and now we're starting to also mingle with formal education. So we kind of also experimenting how, as a non-accredited and informal space for artistic learning, we can also start working closely or learn from accredited structures, but not like further education, not higher education. So these are the 6 cohorts. We have about up to 14 artists a year. They apply with a simple application process. They don't need to have gone to art school before. They don't need to have any formal qualification. Some of them have not been to university, but most of them have done a BA. What we try to do is to constitute a group that's going to be really working with each other, quite cohesive, with different interests, different medias, different backgrounds, and is going to be very much about how they can support each other and really form a network of people who will continue dialoguing for a long time. What was interesting is that 2 days ago, in our space, we invited 2 people from the first year at Open School East, and they came to give a day-long talk and kind of workshop around the research they're doing at an institution called Gasworks in London, where I used to work as a curator a long time ago. We invited them, and it was interesting to see how people who've gone through Open School East are now not just engaging with kind of critical subjects and institutional questions. So some of our artists have gone to do some biennials. We have an alumnus who was at the Venice Biennial this year. So we've got all these kind of nice success stories. But we also have people, and that's not incompatible at all, but we have also people who are working really hard to develop projects that are pushing the boundaries of institutions today. So for example, Andrea Franco and Rose Jardine from year 1 have been developing this evaluation framework for Gasworks. On the assumption that, because in England, every time you do a project, you have to evaluate, and evaluation is very quantitative. It's like, how many people have come, how many hard-to-reach communities have you engaged, how many, people of color have come, etc. And we're interested in this information, but we're slightly suspicious about what people do with this information, and I don't think we learn from this quantitative information. So they wanted to put together a framework that's looking qualitatively at how projects succeeded or failed, and also start inventing new words which move away from the evaluation frameworks that essentially replicates kind of power structures and systems. So it was super interesting to have them there, and it was great for the current associate artists to see that, some people were really, deeply embedded, doing amazing projects, really working within the art world, but not necessarily as they expected, in commercial galleries or, elsewhere. So, so now we're working with this lot here. And what else can I say? So the way it works, it's a year-long program. It's free. It's non-accredited. They get a shared studio space, which they can use 24 hours, 7 days a week, and they get 2 days of tuition and mentorship. So we invite a group of mentors every year. I mean, sometimes we work with the same people, sometimes we add new people, and usually they're suggested by the last cohort of associates. The first term is usually around an invitation to an artist to develop a curriculum, and I'll give an example now. And the second and third terms are devised by the associates. So they get together in groups, identify their common interest, we give them budgets, we give them contacts, we give them guidance, and they really develop their curriculum themselves and push the boundaries of what it is to do public programming. It gives them visibility, it gives them the opportunity to meet their kind of dream practitioner, it gives them the opportunity to also just develop a dialogue and possibly a collaboration with someone. It doesn't need to be a star, it could be someone who's barely 2 years older than them. But it also kind of, pushes them to put their research and their work out in public. And at the end of that, they are super good arts administrators, and they often tend to come together and run a space, start a space, and do something that's in the vibe of Open School East. So there've been at least 3 groups of associates who've created their own space, and there's still 2 working, one in London and one in Margate, and they're doing kind of really interesting work too, at least to my standards. First term, just to give you some ideas. So last year we worked with an artist called Marguerite Humeau, who is French but based in London. She started, we always say to an artist, is not just devising a curriculum, you're not just here to educate. It's got to be really in line with your interests and your research, and we want you to get something huge out of it, otherwise it's not really worth it. So she was working, big themes of her, the afterlife and kind of, post-humanism, post-nature, etc. And she came with the idea that she wanted to work with the first mausoleum of the first emperor of China, called Emperor Qin. It's a mausoleum that is still unexcavated. It's guarded by the Terracotta Army, which he built to defend his mausoleum. His mausoleum was filled with beautiful things, but also, I mean, he worked with the finest engineers and craftspeople and architects. He had a representation of the 100 rivers of China in a mercury system. He had someone to develop candles that would never, burn and never extinguish. He went with his many wives. He took everything with him in the afterlife. So engineering, fine art, craft, architecture, his wives, all the pleasures in life. So she asked the question. So we did this project and with the associate artists, but we also invited members of the public to join in. And the question that was asked is, what would you take in the afterlife? So they had across the course of 3 months, they worked together, and she invited lots of different people to help her in this quest. So she worked with architects, with sound engineers, with a forager in that case, where they made an elixir of eternal life. She invited a local embalmer who strangely is called Mr. Go. He's a funeral director, and he told us about, embalming and how you keep a body alive. He told us about how he embalmed his own dad, which was super gory. Showed us some pictures, talked about Lenin, etc. We had some more making sessions around casting, and then lots of different things happened. And at the end, there was this final project that was public. So we had a number of people coming, but also a number of people who we picked up from the beach. It was a really nice day. And they devised this 45-minute long walk with sound pieces, with different moments of where the public was, the attention was called, with announcements, and they talked about the different pieces, whether they were sculptural or sonic, were about the different forces that they would take in the afterlife with them. So they chose to take empathy, touch, function and dysfunction, shame, and a few others. Took the form of a walk. We used the caves as a kind of naturally acoustic environment. Some people made some sculptures. There were all sorts of objects we would find on the beach, and sometimes there were actors around them, and sometimes it was like a random person who thought this is a nice spot. It's in front of the goddess of shame, some sculptures, a performance. And then we went back to Open School East and had this lunch with lots of different bits of food around all this, function, dysfunction, kind of vegan brains, etc. So then we go into the second term, and that's when they start self-directing their learning. So they would invite anyone from the vocalist Phil Minton, who does this feral choir workshop, mudlarking on the Thames, just picking up pipes and all things from the Thames with the artists Adam Broomberg and Oliver Channerin. Someone in the first year started something called the Bad Vibes Club, which was a reading group and a lecture series. And this still continues. We supported him for 2 years. He can continue doing things at Open School East, and we still work with him. And the project now has a life of its own, includes commissions, and it's got different manifestations. And he introduced us to Sally O'Reilly, who's a creative writer who has since become an important person at Open School East. She's a mentor, but we've done projects with her too. One of the associates, Paul Maeke, did an event called Beyond Beyoncé. So at the time in London, we were working in a building where there were different users, and there was the Carnival group from Hackney. So it was about the representation of the black female body in hip-hop culture and the media in general, and he wanted to work across generations. So he started with working on a choreography with the young people, who then asked us all to dance. Then their mums, mostly Jamaican ladies, cooked a big meal, and then we had a discussion with all these generations and people from really different walks of life. Following that, a lot of people came to us and said, this was an interesting space, we want to do something there. And our policy was that we would then really allow the space to be used by different groups to, as a safe space or whatever they needed it for. And we would do collaborations with them if they wanted, or we just leave them, give them the keys, trust them, and, let them use the space and the very few resources we have. So I'm just going to go through now quite quickly. We've done all sorts of things, kind of big dinner and session around Climaveau with the cooking sections, fashion resistance workshop this year with a fashion designer from Margate. That's the associates inviting an artist called and performer Daniel Oliver, preparing for fantastical post-apocalyptic neurodivergent future. That's a workshop around science fiction and incomers and foreigners in Margate. Margate is also a place that is the kind of the birth of Brexit, practically. So there are lots of complicated social questions there. They've decided to do collaborations with other places. So we work a lot with Garden Gate Project, which is a community garden that works with people with learning difficulties and mental health issues. So they did a workshop around, partly academic with ethnobotanists who would come and talk about certain subjects, but also kind of practical things by the sea. And then we also do regular collaborations with universities that want to get out of the university context. So that's more recently we've been working with the Centre for Critical Thought in Kent at the University of Kent. It's the law department, and we discussed, and we thought it would be a good idea to have a seminar series that would run from Open School East. So this is in our current space in the community cafe, which we share with many other people. We're not fully responsible for the decoration, or not at all, but we work on it. And when we started at Open School East in the first building in London, we didn't know exactly how we could tell people we were there, and we existed as a resource. And it wasn't just an artist development program, but it was also a space for everyone to congregate and learn a skill or just socialize. And we started working quite quickly with a group of senior citizens who were operating from a small space on an estate, and that was closed. And then we said, okay, come and do things from here. So they did lots of things, like they used computer literacy as an excuse to socialize and get together. They did Spotify dance parties. We organized a radio workshop, intergenerational, and then some of the associates were involved, and this continued. So the nice thing when things go well, and I apologize, I always talk about the things quite positively, but of course there are lots of problems in running a space of that kind. But when things go well, a project finishes or funding finishes, and then usually the group that has been constituted through this event wants to continue and gets together, and we give them, again, the keys, access to equipment, and they can continue. So this group, Parallel Radio, now they've changed their name, but they're still active and still operating from London, from different places, get to be invited in different locations. And then following this project, we said to the older generation, what do you think is missing, in your neighborhood? What would you want to do? And they said, well, there's no cinema, and we're just a bit bored of seeing all these mainstream films. We'd like to make our own films, so listen to our own stories being told. So we started this project kind of out of their feedback, which was a 9-month long project led by the artist Neil Cummings, which led to a small festival where we screened a number of films. It was bound to be a total disaster, but the films were actually really nice, where you had, lots of short films. One of them was an older guy talking about how his car park in his estate had been shut and how he fought the council. But it was really funny. There was some kind of humoristic moments. And then there was also a film which was, a young lesbian woman who had to Airbnb a place in London because she didn't have enough money, talking to an elderly woman from Mauritius who was, was very traditional and very kind of Catholic, and it was all about kind of different perceptions, different encounters, intergenerational meetings, and also the concept of place and what it means to live in Hackney, in a place that is vastly gentrified and where there's no rent control and people are just driven out. So yeah, there's an artistic product in the end, but what happens in between and the encounters that it provokes for members of the public, for users, but also for the associate artists who then go on and collaborate at length with these different people if they want to, is something that we're really interested in and after. So then, at the beginning, we didn't want to do an end of the year show because that looked a bit too traditional. We didn't want to replicate exactly what an MA would do, but then we just realized it was important to have a space that would federate the year, or a moment that would just bring something to a close and people could have something. And some people are not actually artists at Open School. So on the left, we have Shiri Shalmi, who is a curator. She started the Anti-University Now Festival, which is still active today and is super interesting. This is Michael Whitby, who is more of a chef, and he kind of realized that art wasn't really for him. And Open Schoolist is also that place where it's not just about becoming a successful artist, it's about experimenting with different ways. Sophie Mallet has become kind of more prominent in the art world, and she's one of our associates. Anyway, for that show, she's become one of our mentors. They just did a pun and started a restaurant for a week called Open School Eats. Then we had some shows, different years, performances, long-term projects, more conventional art exhibitions. And then we get invited to do lots of things elsewhere. So sometimes we go on a residency. Sometimes we get invited to do things outside, and we always involve the associates. So that's an associate from year 2 who went to Dakar last year for the Art Summit. And then we get invited by kind of project spaces in London. This one is very interested in alternative art schools and invites all the alternative art schools in the country every year for a season. And then we work with project spaces in town as well, where they invite us for short residencies, so the associates have got this more professional setting to experiment with and work in. We did a project with the Whitstable Biennial, which was, to begin with, quite chaotic, but then ended up as a slow dance, and was something quite special. And then we work with young people. So in 2016, we were saying, this is working, but the problem is the people who apply to be associates are mostly people who know already about the art world, or they already have a sense that this is a possibility. They know where to find us, and we're really small, and we don't want to be just found by people who have a foot in that world already. So we need to start working with younger people who are, have creative talent, are interested in the arts, but most likely will never get to find out about us because we're so niche, and we don't want to be this exclusive place. So we did a project for 2 weeks with a group of 10 young people from Hackney, 16 to 18 years old, and we did a year of Open Schoolist, but condensed into 2 weeks, like super intensive, and they went to work with very different artists, doing sculpture, architecture with MEF architects, radio with the people who were organizing the parallel radio program with the elderly people. And so this is something that's continuing, and we're about to start a new program, which I'll talk about in a second. And what we did when we arrived in Margate, in that first building I showed you, it was a residential street, and so we came, we thought, obviously things are going to change. So I should say that we moved to Margate because we couldn't afford as an organization to stay in London. Our lease was so uncertain, prices were going up, artists were really struggling to spend time with us and have the headspace to be with us even 2 days a week. They had like 3 part-time jobs, and we were not interested in catering for the wealthy, well-off artists. So we decided to go somewhere where we knew we could get more, more accessible funding. And the moment we moved to Margate on this street, so we thought, we'll try, we'll see how we're going to shift things. We're moving from a big capital city where there's a lot of culture to a really small seaside town where there's an art center called Turner Contemporary, but it's a very deprived place. This area of Margate is called Cliftonville, and in the UK you have 32,000 wards or small districts, and this is the 4th poorest ward in the country. So I don't know if you know the data about the UK is not it's the 5th economic power, but it's also like a 5th of the population lives under the poverty line, and there's children are hungry. It's just completely insane, and that street is really epitomizes the problem. And lots of kids started arriving and saying, oh, this is new, because we were at street level, and they were like, what is going on here? This is interesting. Mostly Roma kids who don't have the money to go to an after-school class. The youth club only starts for 12 years old onwards. There were lots of really small children. Their parents don't have any money. Their flats are overcrowded. And they were like, they didn't let go. They just knocked and knocked and knocked. And we just had to do something with them. And now we've incorporated them in our programs. And it wasn't the plan at all to work with children. It wasn't our ambition, but then it became, you know, quite transformative for the organization, because suddenly we were like, okay, so what do we do when we work with children? We need to have policies in place. We need to have training. We need to understand health and safety and safeguarding, and, you know, so you become a bit more rigid, a bit more institutional, because you have to cater for these people, but at the same time you become more open and more accessible and more hospitable to, you know, the neighborhood. So, you know, in effect now we try and respond to what people ask us to do as much as possible. So we did, they decided to call it the Despacito Art School, following the carnival that they participated in, and we try and match the activities with the themes of the associates program. So when we were working on the afterlife, then we did something about death, but in a gentle way, and about futurism. And one of the kids, Kevin, did like a mummy and a sarcophage, which is pretty funny. And then they just come to things. So this is like supposedly an adult event, but then it's usually kind of taken over by kids. And that was actually like last week. We had, so we moved to this building in the center of town, and this is a very different neighborhood to Cliftonville, where we were before. It's 10 minutes walk, but a lot of kids just don't pass that threshold. So we go and pick them up, and then we bring them back every Wednesday. And then we did this big show with them and for their parents. And that was amazing to see their parents coming, and we did this screening, big event. And then the program we're starting now is the Young Associates program. So the Young Associates program is going to be a little bit like the Associates program. It's a year long. It's going to be free, but it's going to be accredited. It's for 16 to 18 years old who are not in education, training, or employment, who are basically dropping out of school or unhappy with the mainstream education system for all sorts of reasons, but usually for reasons of kind of social and economic deprivation. And we're starting this program, which will be in September. We've been doing tester workshops to start recruiting young people. And it is an arts and design course. It's going to be initially a year long, but if it goes well, we'll do it to 2 years, so then they can get the full qualification to go to university after if they want to. And we're working with, you know, some of the most exciting practitioners, people who are not necessarily educators, but who are kind of brilliant references for the young people. So we're doing a furniture making unit with the architecture collective Assemble. So that's one example where they're making stools. I missed that. Sorry, so that's the missing image. You could see the stools. We're working with a sculptor called Nicolas Deschaise on kind of sculpture and engagement with materials and production processes. We're doing graphic design. We're doing printmaking. We're doing music, radio, and sound production, and film and video. Film and photography, digital and analog. And for this, I mean, what's going to be interesting is that it's going to be accredited, so we've got to follow a rigid format, but then that's not what we tell our guests. We tell them, just develop an idea, it's got to be brilliant, it's got to have a real life application. So for example, we're trying to take over that cafe that I showed you with a yellow background, because it's the guy who was running it has left, and someone needs to take over that cafe, and we were thinking maybe we can help, and we can, you know, start doing cookery lessons in there and start running a community cafe from there. And the young associates will be able to make the furniture and the bar for it and just update it, make it a bit more hospitable with the designers, graphic designers. Kellenberger White will be doing the graphic identity for the whole building. So in a way, they're learning, they have access to great people. They can also do apprenticeships with them at the end, or at least some work placements. And then they get to have their work and what they've done in a real context. So that's what we're working towards. And the two programs, like Associates Program and Young Associates Program, are going to run parallel. Every associates are going to be like mentors or references for one of the young associates, kind of adopt a young associate. And there'll be lots of different things going on. So that's it for Open Schoolist. I will move now to the second part. So I've been doing this. What I didn't say is that we were 4 people when we started this. So it was the curator, Sarah McCrory, who now runs the Goldsmiths Centre for Contemporary Art in London, Sam Thorne, who now directs Nottingham Contemporary in the Midlands in England, and the freelance producer, Lawrence Taylor. So it was the 4 of us, and we got money from the Barbican Centre and from an organization called Create London. So initially we entered this competition for a year-long project that would engage communities creatively in East London, came up with a school idea. It was a bit different, won the competition. They gave us £100,000, and then we had to run it. So I was initially part of this very first competition, and then when they got the money, they said, okay, we need someone now to develop it and run it. How about you? And I said, okay, but I have to do it with one of you. So Lawrence and I worked together. Sam and Sarah joined, became advisors and joined the board. And yeah, it was interesting it's quite unusual to start an alternative school with money and then you run out of money and then you have to think, how are you going to survive? And it was clear that we didn't want to be a year-long project, and we were under huge pressure as well from the Barbican Centre to give lots of data, to tell them how many people we engaged. So we had a contract. We had to deliver activities for 600 hard-to-reach people and 3,000 people with low cultural engagement over the course of the year, and they would give us the money. So it's a very kind of transactional thing. Today we're a charity. We fund it by the Arts Council on a regular basis. We get money from trusts and foundations, and we get money from individual donors as well. We are 5 people now in the office, all part-time, and with different roles, and so just to give a context. But so it's been a while since I've been doing this, and we did things quite intuitively. And we learned a lot through different projects, but there was this desire to engage a bit more with these topics theoretically, and also to understand the lineage of present-day alternative spaces. So I embarked on a part-time PhD at the University of Nottingham in 2016. So that's a 6-year PhD, and this is the end of my 3rd year. And I'm doing it in the School of Geography with the main supervisor in geography and another supervisor in education. And my PhD title is, I think it's here, What Makes an Alternative Space? A conceptual, organizational and physical exploration of alternative learning, social and art centers in the UK from the late 19th century to the present. So it's quite a project, and it was very different to begin with. Well, actually it wasn't. It was exactly like that, but then we moved it completely, and then it's going back to that. But what I'm interested in is really questioning that term alternative. What do we mean by alternative? How long is this? How long is an alternative for? Does it have a lifespan? And lots of spaces and practices call themselves or deem themselves alternative, but in practice, you realize that a lot of, for example, the management systems are definitely not alternative, and they're more very conventional and quite hierarchical. So I'm not saying ours is not particularly, is not alternative. Well, I'm not saying it's completely alternative. It's pretty straightforward as a structure, but that's also the UK system. But I'll go back to that at some point. So So what I call an alternative space essentially is a building-based, locally rooted and democratic cultural, educational and social center in which different forms of learning, sociabilities, publics and uses cohabit. So in a nutshell, what I name an alternative space combines the functions of a neighborhood center, a school and an art center. It might consider itself alternative for the pedagogical, artistic, and programmatic methods it uses, for the ways in which it engages and hosts publics, for its governance and funding models, for its self-scrutinizing nature, or for its conception or use of architectural space. So I trace the origins of present-day alternative spaces in the UK back to two movements. The first one, and I give an example here of Toynbee Hall, is the social and university settlement movement, which started in the in the 1880s and peaked in the 1920s. The settlements were learning and social reform centers founded by universities and philanthropists in deprived areas of major industrial centers such as London, Manchester, Boston, Chicago, or New York. They lodged educated and well-off individuals who came to share their privilege and knowledge with working men and women and help their social emancipation with a view to writing social reforms together. So here you see, it's one of the very first university settlements in London, and it's quite seminal because it was quite radical. It's really where socialism was born, is where the welfare reform was also born. So Clement Attlee, who was the first Labour, leader of the Labour Party, and who then became the first Labour Prime Minister in the UK, went through Toynbee Hall. Is William Beveridge, who was the guy who put together the welfare system based on kind of free education, free healthcare, different forms of benefits, housing, etc. He also went through Toynbee Hall. And Toynbee Hall still exists today, and it's changed a lot. It's gone through a lot of phases, but still doing quite impressive work today in terms of local and local campaigns around housing, around inclusion, around transportation for elderly people, and it acts at kind of policy level, has a kind of real social impact. The arts are less present, but the people who run Toynbee Hall, the founders of Toynbee Hall, Samuel Barnett and Henrietta Barnett, were big art aficionados, and they organized a lot of exhibitions with the artists of the times who were a bit radical and kind of socialist, like some of the pre-Raphaelites. Different people who were also later associated with the suffragette movement. And the Barnetts also were the founders of the Whitechapel Gallery in London. So they really advocated for free libraries, free art for everyone. The second movement I'm looking at is the art centers movement, or we could call it also the community art centers movement. But the art centers movement started after World War II and peaked in the 70s in the UK, but also in Europe and the US. And the Arts Council was founded in 1946, I think, and very quickly, I think that same year, they published a report saying art centers, every town should have one. So the idea was that every town should have its own space for culture and entertainment, and depending on their location and the existing provision, some art centers would serve more a social function than others and shape their programs in response to the needs of the surrounding communities. This is a really interesting space called Centerprise. It doesn't actually say on the slide. Centerprise was located very close to Open School East and closed a year before Open School East started. And a lot of the people, especially the elderly Jamaican communities who came to Open School East, used to go to Centerprise and then migrated to Open School East. So we kind of, without really knowing it at the time, really fulfilled a kind of a transitory role, and then we left 3 years later. Centerprise was there for, I think, from 1969 to 2012. They occupied 3 different locations in Hackney, in Dalston. They were started by a bunch of activists and intellectuals who were into education for all, who were into writing, publishing, and they wanted to open a bookshop where everyone would get the chance to read really radical things and have them translated if need be, but also everyone would have a chance to write and publish. And this initial group was active for 4 years, and then they said, that's it, we're leaving. Or they said at the beginning, we will leave, and then we're starting this cooperative, but we want people to then take over because it will be healthy. And then it went through a lot of waves. It was a cooperative for a long time, so the really interesting model in terms of governance and its programming. And then it became a regularly funded organization with a director at the top, a very hierarchical structure. Then they had lots of problems, and in the end, in 2012, the council just took the building away from them. It was a building you see on this picture here. This is actually a representation of the building where you have, I don't know if you can read, but you've got the basement where you have, it was used for meetings, then again, youth activities on the left, bookshops on the ground floor, coffee bar, which you can see here as well, the bookshop you can see here. And then it was an advice center. Toynbee Hall also created the first poor man's lawyer scheme, which became known as the Citizen Advice Bureau, and that's still active today. And this was a place where you could just say, I've just been, kicked out of my house. I've got 3 children. They're threatening to take my children into care. What can I do? It was quite a white institution to begin with, and then gradually it turned into an organization really serving the Black community around Hackney. It was mixed, but it's interesting to see the trajectory. So then they had a public office, and then they were publishing, they were writing, they were doing lots of workshops. They had a youth club, etc. So this is something that's my second case study in a way. Toynbee Hall, the first one, is something that's been really researched, but it's not been researched within that question in comparison with the community art centers movement, and certainly not in comparison with what's happening today in terms of the re-emergence of alternative social pedagogy and art centers. So one of the hypotheses of my research is that alternative spaces are deeply entangled with the concept and history of the welfare state, most particularly, but not only in the UK. The evolution of alternative spaces follows in many ways the trajectory of the welfare state, which the historian Derek Fraser summed up in these terms. So the welfare state germinated in the social thought of late Victorian liberalism, reached its infancy in the collectivism of the pre- and post-Great War statism, matured in the universalism of the 40s, and flowered in bloom in the consensus and affluence of the 50s and 60s. By the 1970s, it was in decline, like the faded rose of autumn. So the relationship between the late 19th century settlements and the welfare state has already been highlighted quite a lot. And in a nutshell, the settlements were created in response to the poverty and the disempowerment of the working class in the late industrial period. They paved the way for the welfare state and became somewhat redundant in the 1930s when this was achieved, or it was starting to be achieved. And that led to an important number of closures. You had about 400 settlements within 10 years of the movement being created, and by then there were probably 150 left, and today you have probably, I don't know exactly, probably 30 left in the UK. So the settlements then fulfilled, again, they reappeared in World War II, and they fulfilled an important aid function, and they became decidedly outdated in the post-war periods, which led to more closures, as well as their reinvention, like Toynbee Hall, which completely reinvented itself. For their part, art centers came out of the welfare state's burgeoning period immediately after World War II, as I was saying with that report from the Arts Council, and were largely the initiative of government's Department of Culture. They peaked in the 70s and declined in the 1980s. Those that survived chose 2 routes: institutionalization and professionalization in the given field, or commitment to community development. So those who know London, you would know Camden Art Centre. Camden Art Centre was started as an art centre on the same level pretty much as something like the Blackie in Liverpool or the Battersea Art Centre, and they're all very different. And Camden is now like an established, public gallery with a, very proper kind of art world footing, while others have just decided to be really community spaces. In their own different ways, both, whether, whatever route they've taken, both have filled in for the government's disengagement with extracurricular social and educational provision, and with some exceptions, the settlements and the art centers as they were first imagined are now a thing of the past. As the recent neoliberal governments have been busy eradicating the last remnants of the welfare state, a new generation of largely self-initiative, multi-purpose social, cultural and learning centers has emerged to counterbalance the dwindling municipal, cultural, social and educational provision. So my research intends to unfold this very brief history. In this research, I'm trying to answer a few questions from architectural, educational, sociological and political perspectives. How do alternatives relate to the mainstream and or to an ideal of social life? What connects and disconnects with, those? Do they enable and nurture? What constitutes relevant governance, financial and business models for such spaces? What spatial form do alternatives assume? It doesn't really, well, it does come across. I mean, I think that's a really interesting way of it's a spatial representation of activity, and I'm very interested in, even in the way Open School has been so different from one building to another, starting in a civic building, which was a council-led owned building, to a private building, to now being in an active council and educational building. And how you inhabit space and how the architecture can help you, or can align or not, with your emancipatory kind of education commitment. What does it take to remain alternative as internal and external circumstances change? And how do alternative learning, social and art spaces relate to the broader society-wide production of political, economic and social alternatives? So I've chosen the academic system to carry out this research rather than an independent path. And for me, that felt like a necessary provocation. And I kind of asked myself, how could academia help support both financially and theoretically research on learning environments that exist a lot outside of established circuits, but actually not so much outside. And this is what I'm interested in, is this kind of alternative spaces are not opposed to the mainstream, they're more in between. So in a comparative, a book called A Comparative Ethnography of Alternative Space, written in 2013 by two anthropologists, Jens Dahl and Esther Phil. And this is a study of material and immaterial spaces or alternative spaces, such as Pang in Western China or the Danish Siemens Church in Singapore. The anthropologists write, alternative spaces are in-between spaces rather than oppositional structures, and as such both inside and outside its constitutive elements. The in-between position potentially gives the members of the alternative spaces the possibility of controlling their own agenda without engaging in open conflict with the existing dominant structures. As alternative spaces are found to be nurtured by the very power structures that they potentially react against, however, they are not sites for revolution or rebellion as such. They are rather sites of volatile resistance linked to other forms of power that lies in the ability to maneuver just outside of the dominant institutions or systems. So they're neither completely in nor completely out. They navigate between margin and center in defiance of binaries, Preferring ambiguity to fixity, they occupy a place that is simultaneously conformant with and resistant to the establishment. The human geographer Peter Craftel similarly calls for the recognition that alternative learning spaces and approaches are or should be both connected and disconnected to the mainstream. And as such, Craftel objects to the tendency for alternative education to be pitched as a binarized other to mainstream education. In a book called Alternative Education for the 21st Century, the educationalists Woods and Woods identify 3 orientations for educational alternatives. The first one implies strict separation from mainstream education and its institutions. The second one indicates an engagement with them through pragmatic relationships. And the third one tries to alter the conditions that give rise to any adverse consequences suffered by the educational alternative from its positioning on the margins and or to change the policies and practices that restrict mainstream education. So the third one is less clear-cut than the 2 previous orientations, and it offers prospect of resistance to strict categorization by bringing the margin closer to the center and vice versa, by partially demarginalizing and decentering. In 2002, the artist and writer Julie Auld edited Alternative Art New York, 1965-1985, a collection of essays that record the rise and fall of the alternative art movement and its spaces in New York between 65 and 85. 8 years after the publication of her research, she critically revised her position on the topic. She wrote, "The very word alternative produces endless arguments. It is provocative and meaningless, and suggests simultaneously an opening up and a closing down. Naming oneself alternative sets up both distance from and bondage to dominant institutions and ideas. It implies both a subordinate and a rebellious, perhaps productive, relationship to power. For critically constructive activities and structures, it becomes essential to reject the term as a label. The more radical a group or efforts, the more likely it is to resist the tag. We are not alternative to anything is a much echoed sentiment that defies simple binary readings of power and its dynamics. Resisting the label positions margin as center, maybe not center-center, but central in a given context." So Auld's rejection of the label is sparked by disillusion with the alternative art movement and how spaces have either closed, become institutionalized, or been absorbed by other institutions. A promotion of a third way that is able to challenge and redraw formally strict boundaries, i.e. margin and center, itself echoes the idea of critical thirding that is put forward by the architect, urbanist, Edward Soja. Oh, that's the wrong one. Oh, I don't have the one. I'll read it to you. In what I call a critical strategy of thirding as othering, I try to open up our spatial imaginaries to ways of thinking and acting politically that respond to all binarisms, to any attempt to confine thought and political action to only 2 alternatives by interjecting an other set of choices. In this critical thirding, the original binary choices is not dismissed entirely, but subjected to a creative process of restructuring that draws selectively and strategically from the 2 opposing categories to open new alternatives. So Auld's position isn't quite binary, but she does lament the ambiguity of the label alternative, both distant from and absorbed by institutions. And I'm interested, alongside many other people, in reclaiming the word alternative as consciously ambiguous, in between and interdependent with, rather than codependent with or in rejection of dominant institutions. And I go to my next quote, which is from the economist geographers J.K. Gibson Graham, who write about the propensity of alternative organizations to accept financial help from people who are on the other side, governments and bodies with diverging values and purposes. And they write, While recognizing the risk of cooptation that such relationships pose, they refuse to see cooptation as a necessary condition of consorting with power. Instead, it is an ever-present danger that calls forth vigilant exercises of self-scrutiny and self-cultivation, ethical practices, one might say, of not being co-opted. And self-criticality and self-scrutiny is definitely a key attribute of alternative spaces. I'll take the example of artist Tania Bruguera, who founded Cátedra Arte de Conducta in Havana. And she explained in a book written by Sam Thorne, one of the co-founders of Open Schoolist. The book is called School, A Recent History of Independent Art Schools. So she explained to him how in 2009, the Instituto Superior de Arte, who had kind of created it and enabled the project in the first place, tried to co-opt the school. So it was started in, I think, 2001, 2002. 7 years later, it was a different person directing the place, and Cátedra Arte de Conducta was now seen as disobedient and generative of ideas that were, and art forms that were critical of Cuba's governments, policies, and institutions. And the response was to close Cátedra Arte de Conducta rather than being co-opted. My second reason to close it, I quote her, was because it had become an institution. The whole project was about how you change an institution from the inside, not how you become an institution yourself. I always say that you have to be very vigilant not to turn into what you critique. So when the relationship between Cátedra Arte de Conducta and Instituto Superior de Arte was peaceful, one used the other for administrative support and the other one for self-critical efforts to be involved with a structure that did things differently. What's interesting is that Cátedra Arte de Conducta was started because Tania Bruguera had met the director of the Instituto Superior de Arte at a dinner. She didn't know she was the director, and she just went on and on about how rubbish the school was and how shocking it was. And at some point she said, I'm the director, but I'm open to your criticism. Can you come up with a proposal? And she came up with that proposal. And it was essentially a pragmatic relationship. If we go back to the 3 options given by Woods and Woods, is, I'll help you, through me, you'll be able to make artists travel and have visas, and it will make us look good, like we are actually thinking about our institution and how to make it better. But that finished because then a conservative director arrived, and this was the end of the program autonomy, and this was the reason why it closed. So I'm going to finish here in a fairly abrupt way, but I'm just going to say that there are lots of things in here, lots of questions around self-institutionalization, and is this in contradiction with being alternative? And I mean, the whole idea is that I'm trying to find ways in between and not to be so binary like I have been, in my whole life. And I'm trying to, see the pros and cons and see how we can, Open Schoolist was started because of the Barbican Center. It became an institution in itself. Is gone from a project started by friends to a proper institution. I'm the only one left there from the original group. Everyone else is involved, and they certainly don't have the same relationship that I have with the place. So there are lots of questions like that, how far do you go into the institutionalization of an institution? What is positive institutionalization? What is habit? And, habit is something that Sarah Ahmed writes about in a beautiful way in relationship to diversity in the workplace through a feminist and intersectional reading. But also mechanisms of inclusion and exclusion. So I've not updated the Open Schoolist website yet, but we've decided recently that we were not going to call ourselves an inclusive institution anymore, but a non-exclusive one, which I quite like. So I need to get on with that. And these ideas of inclusion, who is excluded, how does the system exclude, and who is included is something that the sociologist Ruth Levitas, who is specializes in kind of utopian studies, write about quite a lot. But also the subjects of adult and community education, socialism, because it's clearly about this, critical pedagogy, and also questions of institutional memory are keeping me busy, and we can discuss this. But I think that this idea, being the last one from the original group left at Open School East, I'm very aware that I'm the only one who's got a connection with all the artists who've gone through, with all the community groups we've worked with all the users of Open School East. And the moment I go, this is gone. And we try really hard to keep the group together, and there's a very strong alumni community. I get in touch with a lot of them. We invite them, but you have to have this knowledge. And what happens when I let go finally, give the organization to someone else or to several people. And what do you do with this? It's not just about archiving or live archiving. It's also about this kind of connections you have with people. What do you do with it? So I'll finish here.
Thank you, Anna. I'm curious, you kind of mapped out the rise and fall of the alternative space alongside the welfare state, and I'm interested also in the terminology of the word alternative alongside terms that perhaps rose as the welfare state declined, in terms of neoliberal terminology like innovation and disruption. And I wonder whether that also parallels our kind of expectations of institutions. When you think of an institution like a hospital, you don't expect that to be alternative or innovative. Maybe you just want it to be functional. So I also, and terms like disruption come very much from a business world or a kind of internet startup kind of terminology, and I wonder whether you've also seen that kind of creeping into the kind of evaluation regimes that you've also been dealing with. So that's not really a question, but
You mean the term innovation or this? Oh, yeah.
If you think the word alternative has maybe somehow been co-opted into innovative and disruptive.
Possibly. I'm very cautious about the term alternative. It doesn't say alternative on the website of Open School East anywhere. We don't use that term. But I just had to have a term to grapple with for my PhD. And sometimes it's easier to explain. For some people say, what do you mean alternative art school? I'm interested in, it's got, that word has been, like a lot of words are co-opted in different ways, and I think it's not necessarily a reason why you can't. It's a very good point what you're making, and I need to research this a bit more. Sorry, I'm processing my thoughts. I've been very interested in co-working spaces. I find them utterly disgusting, and I just hate this. And people call them, in France you have this expression called tiers-lieu, and tiers-lieu makes you think a little bit of tiers cinema, third cinema, and tiers paysage, the theory of the kind of third landscape by Gilles Clément, and so, but actually tiers-lieu are what people might call alternative, working environments or or congregation environments, and they are just businesses, and co-working spaces. It's you have this idea. Oh, let's have everything together. We could have a bakery. That's really cool, and we'll have like people in tech, being there, and then you'll have makers, and there are lots of these spaces emerging. Do people call them alternative? Probably, yeah. And I have to. I will write a section on this kind of third spaces, which are not really. It's not like the third space that Edward Soja writes about. It's not this. But I'm still interested in reclaiming that term, and I might give up at some point. But I think I am, in the same way that I think if we gave up on the word feminism because it's been co-opted by, bad politics or policies, we would constantly have to reinvent, that word. But I'm interested. Yeah, the problem with the term alternative is that naturally it lends itself to this kind of binary thing. It's alternative to something. And I'm interested in more intersectional thinking and trying to find ways in between that are not just saying this is like that or like that. In evaluation, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Sorry, I'm not answering this question very well, but I'm taking something from it.
I'm just curious about how, from your side, the terminology in terms of justifying what you do has changed, or at least how you go about justifying what you do without being trapped in the same terminology of saying that, well, we're innovative and we're different. Hey, you know, like.
I think we've got the word innovative on our website, which I need to change because I also hate that word. But
I use the word versatile, which I think is really nice.
Yeah. Thanks. Write it down. Yeah, I mean, it's changing all the time because it's evolving all the time. So every year, the current cohort of associates kind of question and challenge lots of things, and we change the way we do things. So they're really kind of influencing the organization. And then we might have someone who join us as a fundraiser and start writing funding application. I'm like, oh, that sounds quite good, you know? So, you know, we also define Open Schoolies as a space that provides, actually, I think my colleague uses the term, provides learning to, I can't remember, but there are different ways of talking about it, whether we write a funding application, whether we talk to people who are interested in the art side and utterly disinterested in the more social aspect of what we do, and vice versa, people who are like social you know, workers or charitable organizations who really don't understand the value and the meaning of the Associates program. So it's always been this constant struggle between the two things, and the way we talk about it evolves all the time, and we're trying to find a language that's a bit, that's at the same time clear, but also quite ambitious in its way of, you know, we won't use words that my colleague who edits the website doesn't understand, and is, you know, someone with who is neurodiverse and is very against the idea of having words that are just, you know, cutting accessibility, you know. So we're thinking a lot about these things. We're thinking about language in more creative ways, but we're not massively creative with it. I met someone recently in Geneva who runs a space called, oh, it's not a space, it's a kind of educational social project called La Marmite. And it's and went on his website before I met him, and I was like, oh my God, this is just insane. It says this organization is there to give a voice to the voiceless, to the most deprived people. I'm like, I could never have vocabulary like that on my, because it looks like we're a council organization doing, you know, being good doers, and that's not what we want to be. And that would be very alienating to talk about the alienated in such a way on our website. But then it's like, oh, no one, that's more for institutions. The people who we work with don't read our website. And I was like, oh, tell me more about it. And then it was super interesting, but then he kept using theater references, and it was like literary references. It was like, so we've started this, you know, we call the group of people the choir, because that makes me think of, you know, a theater piece I studied when I was young. And it was like all very beautiful and poetic, and made me a bit jealous of his innovation. But at the same time I was like, you know, it's kind of bullshit, because it's just a bit pretentious, you know? You don't have to reference everything. You can also do something because you're doing real work and there's a real need, and, you know. So I'm interested in language, and it changes a lot. Yeah, and like, for example, the example of, you know, switching from inclusive to non-exclusive, I think is really nice, because, yeah, it's just, because inclusive is, of course we're not inclusive. Like, how many people actually, like, if you know, a homeless person comes to Open Schoolies, there's nothing we can do for them, you know, in a way, and maybe we can. But if, for example, we were really challenged by an associate last year who had mobility issues, and she was like, you do realize that you need to, in the way you talk to people, you need not only a clear language, but you need also a bigger font, you need more images. There are people with learning difficulties, they don't relate to written words, they want visuals. And what about your access policy? What if I want to invite someone who's got, major mobility issues? What do you have? So she invited someone, and that person sent us 2 pages saying, I need a green room where I can get changed, I need access to a disabled toilet on the ground floor. I need someone to come and pick me up at the airport and take me and be with me the whole time. And we're like, we don't have the resources. We don't have the capacity. We don't, everything is dysfunctional. So we've been thinking about that a lot. I mean, the physical restrictions are hard to come, to solve sometimes when you're not in your own building and the lift is now broken in our building, etc. But you start reflecting on, communication, how you talk to people, and how you can actually be this organization that you think is inclusive. How do you recruit people? How do you interview people? What if people can't write an application? That doesn't mean they're not a good artist. That doesn't mean they don't have talent or ambition. So we're starting to really reflect on all of these aspects and making things less non-alienating. And we're learning a lot from our associates who are so plugged in, with kind of disability, crip theory, intersectional theory and thinking, and they're really teaching us, and that's really amazing. And we're working with them quite closely, and every year we go bit by bit and then just realize how dated we are,
Hi, I had 2 quick questions. One, the first was, if you could, you mentioned this a little bit already, but what changed when you moved from London to Margate, and how that, I guess, both from the audience, but also from your perspective, how the relationship to also being in London, which is obviously an art center, to being somewhere which has a really different socioeconomic and also demographical context. And then the second one was just a quick, if you could clarify something about one of the quotes that you were mentioning that talked about this kind of binary between the third alternative to the binary, but then you mentioned something that it was also about picking from both of the binaries. And for me, this felt like a kind of centrist argument, but maybe that's probably not how you meant it or how it's supposed to be read, because it was sort of well, maybe we should just make this thing that's a little bit more in the middle, when the middle is also part of I would say is part of what the problem is because the left has moved left and the right has moved righter, but then also there's this kind of argument for a center position, which is not radical enough and doesn't really provide anything. It's specifically maybe in the UK with Labour's position. Less now with Jeremy Corbyn, but before where it was more of this kind of Tony Blair sort of bullshit new Labour stuff that really didn't provide anything for anyone. So maybe you could just clarify that quickly. I don't know if this is too much, but.
Second question is challenging. First question, what changed? Lots of things changed. We were small fish in a big pool, and we're a big fish in a small pool. So we have a bit more, we feel that we're influencing things a bit more. So we now, because we're a regularly funded organization by the Arts Council, we now sit on all these boards and networks, and it's mostly pretty boring, but we get to sit with the directors of various institutions, cultural and learning institutions, as well as councillors and people who work, at policy level. And bit by bit, we feel that we have a way in to talk about the problems and to talk about what could change, collectively. So that's really amazing, because we were before that we were just an arts organization doing a bit of social work, in a very amateur way. So now we feel that we're talking to influencers, and it's just on a really small scale, but it feels good to know that we can actually put something out there and it will be heard or not, but Well, we got funding from the Arts Council, which we wouldn't have got if we were in London, and they were very clear. They were like, we decentralizing the funding. We kind of moved partly for that, but both me and my colleague at the time were already living there in the area, so it made sense. What happened in terms of the associates are having, it's hard for them to find work, and it's not the most exciting work. They won't be able to be artist assistant as much as they would in London, so they work in cafes, in bars and stuff. For those who move, because a lot of them move to Margate, and it's not necessarily exciting, but at the same time it's so much cheaper. It's probably 5 times cheaper than living in London, and you don't have to work that hard or that much to earn a living, and just, you know, so they have so much more headspace, and they have, yeah, they're much more present, not only on site but also in their mind, and I think you can see the result and the consequences of that. And in terms of the people who come to visit us, so they come for a day or they come for 2 days. In London, they would come maybe for half a day or maybe a full day, but then they would rush to do that other thing. And now people come, they arrive in Margate, it's an hour and a half. You arrive at the station, the sea is there. They go for a walk, come to the station, or we pick them up. And then we have lunch together, and then we might have a pint at the pub together later. We sit in the park when it's warm. And, you know, the quality of interaction is just so different. So there's a lot more bonding between associates and tutors, and a lot more, a better contact, I think. And more desire to be here on the part of the people, because they've given up their day and they're like really giving themselves. So that's brilliant. I touched a little bit on, how suddenly we found ourselves having to respond to, you know, a bunch of 30 kids who were, you know, not underfed, and, you know, you don't really think about these things, but they come and do some activities with us, and first thing they want is to eat. So you just realize, yes, it's a very different context. And and as I said, I think it's changed us. We understand better how to work with young people, and that's going to be useful when we start working with 16 to 18 years old. The very young people we work with are like 6 to 11, and now some of them have been with us for 2 years, so they're 13, maybe in 3 years, or their brothers and sisters who we don't meet very often, but they're around, they might become young associates. These young kids might become young associates and maybe associates at one point, and it's just a lot easier because it's a small town and you have this direct relationship with people. It doesn't mean that people know who we are and what we do, and we really have to work on how do we make ourselves present to, you know, our immediate neighborhood in this new building, because it's not threatening, but it's a nice building with a history of kind of civic use, but it's not necessarily a place everyone goes to, so they don't necessarily go what's going on the first floor where we are. So yeah, and then the second question, which was a lot harder. I didn't mean to have a centrist position. I think I was trying to say...
No, it was less about your position and more about the quote. Sorry. Maybe like, I was just confused about if that's what they were advocating for.
The third one, for me, it sounds like, you know, I read it as I said, as you know, partly for alternative education to kind of demarginalize itself, and for mainstream education to decenter itself. So it's about trying to break down this, you know, dichotomy, and trying to make it merge a bit more and stop calling something. Yes, stopping pitching the two against each other as the binaryized other. And I mean, you know, these are just quotes. This is what you have to do for your PhD, but it's not my dream to use quotes all the time like that.
No, I mean, I guess specifically in an education context, it's different. But I think if the metaphor is extended to like a larger political discussion, then because if it's about like the left versus the right, you know, which I guess that's not. I mean, it's clearly not how you're using it.
No, it's very based in that educational context. But one of my inquiries is how do these spaces, how do they relate to what's happening at the level of society outside of these physical buildings and their activities? How does that relate to these so-called social political alternatives, you know? this is just a very theoretical proposal I think they make, and that touches specific disciplines, but I don't think it's, we're not seeing that in politics at all. If anything, it's just, well, yeah, it is decentering and demarginalizing. Everything is blurry, everything is, populist and, verging on, I mean, you don't really know, like a lot of people on the left voted for Brexit and a lot of people on the right voted for Brexit, It's just so hard to pin down, but it's going to be something I'm going to have to start thinking about seriously. Sorry, that wasn't very satisfying.
No, it was. Thank you. It was clarifying.
Thank you, Anna. That was a very enlightening talk. From what you explained, or what I saw as well, the space acts as a cross-pollination space where you could also say it's a space of contamination where educators come from established systems of education and I guess have more freedom to experiment with different systems of education. So what I wanted to ask you, or maybe confirm, is to what extent do educators from outside your I'm caught up with definitions now. Your innovative space come to try out different things, which they then try to embed within an established system of education. So what I'm trying to say is, to what extent can these community art centers in the future, since you've looked at the past, define or, let's say, change the system of education, the mainstream, or let's say the approved system of education?
I mean, it's the same with everything. It's like, is a cooperative farm going to change the farming system? I don't think so. Is Open Schoolist and, it's a like-minded organization, are they going to change the education system? I don't think so either. What we can do, I mean, it's really, I want to be positive, but I think it's more, also, I mean, there's a question around funding, it's free, but who pays, And we're very lucky we get Arts Council funding and we've got, some donors and we've got trusts and foundations, but we're the best funded alternative art school and in the UK, And so even if you wanted to replicate the model, who would pay for that? And I mean, I believe that it's, it's a system of cooperation, small things, coming together and then, connecting. And I think that's what alternatives can do. I mean, can they? I'm not sure. That's a big question. We were just talking about.
The funny thing is that alternative education systems now are mostly embraced by private initiatives. So you can find an alternative education school or alternative system, but it's usually private and it's very expensive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So it's absurd. But at the same time, I'm just trying to imagine this flow of movement of people outside of the city. I mean, in the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, I feel like the suburbs and beyond are going to be more and more populated, and people are going to try, experiment with new things because they have, the possibility of trying out new things, or let's say the incentive to try out new things. And this is when perhaps, because you don't live within the city or you don't live within a certain jurisdiction, you can create your own. I mean, this is very utopic, but at the same time, it's in the ways that urbanization works and how it shapes education, I think there is a very direct link. And because of the fact that you're there and you're a big fish in a small pool, you are able to draw in a wide range of people that otherwise wouldn't have where to go in that space. So, and I mean, you're already, let's say, well, not educating, but you're also raising, let's say, awareness to different issues or different ways of thinking. You're providing different ways of thinking to children who are 6 years old. And these children, when they're 10 or 15, might, you know, become associates, as you said, and it's kind of like a domino effect, a hopeful domino effect in that way. And this is where my question kind of comes back to. I know it's a big question.
Essentially, yeah, we're only serving that many people, so so yeah, we can. I mean, we can help the younger people kind of see life a bit differently, but then they go back to school in the really underfunded schools, and with teachers who are, you know, overexploited. And I mean, the education system in the UK is just terrible. It's terrible because it's underfunded, and so, you know, I mean, they come to a non-alienating space once a week, and the rest of the time they're in a place where they can't really do that much, or even if the tutors have got ambition or ideas, they can't really achieve them. So then you're pulling them in and out of the system, and I don't know how easy it is for them. I mean, to give you a concrete example, we had a couple of associates who then went to do an MA after Open School East. One of them had to quit because it was just, she was not used to it. She had no agency there. And the other one just put up with it, but it was excruciating. And, you know, when you give that much freedom and people become, you know, producers of content and producers of ideas, and like the Despacito kid, they've got their own little council, and, you know, and it's not always working, but every now and then when you have people who are a bit more organized, we've got, you know, we try to rotate, and then they decide with the adults the content, and, you know, they make decisions. Of course, they're not allowed to do that at school. So the moment you go back in your system, it's not that easy. So all I can wish for is a proliferation of you know, places like that, but it's not easy to fund it unless you just say, unless you do it in a voluntary manner. But, you know, again, who can be a volunteer? Someone's got money. And then the whole class system is, you know, it's just perpetuating itself. And it's, I wish, I mean, I'm like a utopian as well. I believe in, you know, communes and what could be done if we if we grew our vegetables ourselves and did everything ourselves. But it's very hard, you know. Just think even, you know, I mean, the land is now toxic and polluted. I mean, it's just, it's doomed. It's so...
Thank you.
Sorry, didn't answer your question.
No, it was just, let's say, a thought.
But you're right, alternative education is expensive. All the kids going to Montessori and Steiner school, how much is that a year? It's a fortune. It's brilliant, but it's a fortune. You need a whole system, and what we'd like, I'd like to open a school that really goes from, you know, nursery to the end of your life, and that's my dream. But then it would be, you know, one thing, and it used to exist. There was this place called it was called the Village Colleges. So there was this guy, I think he was called Henry Turner, maybe, and he had this concept in Hertfordshire, and the first village college was commissioned to Walter Gropius, who was just out of the Bauhaus, and it's the only building he built in the UK. And it's called Impington Village College. And the idea was that it was in the countryside. It was initially thought as a school where kids could go, would learn really great things, but they would also learn horticulture, because kids living in the countryside would either go in the cities to learn things, good things, high quality teaching, but they would come back completely unskilled when they came to work in the land. Or then they were super skilled but didn't have, you know, the intellectual baggage they should have when going to school. So that was the idea, and there was no nursery, but started at, like, you know, age 3 or 4, and then went on through. Then there was an adult education department, so you had like it was like that. You had lots of rooms, a swimming pool at the end, and a sports center, and then lots of rooms, all of them on one floor, all of them with windows on directly onto nature. And then you'd go through the years like that. And then there was a theater and community hall, and it was used by, you know, local people, so it was a community center. And then you have this a promenade in the middle where everyone would congregate and sit and have a coffee and talk, teachers, learners, adults, children. You can't do that now because of, well, in England you can't. And then you'd have the adult education bits there. So this was the idea, you know. And it's beautiful, and building is incredible.
And it was made with the thought of creating that common space.
Yeah, definitely, and of having, this kind of, this learning for life, but also, and then they had horticultural classes and stuff like that, so it was kind of different things. But yeah, when I say that, I think it'd be really interesting to have, because we know that if things need to change, it needs to change at a very young level. You know, the moment you start working with children and really help them, then they can really thrive. But it's just the system is just kind of punishes people and excludes people along the way. And by the time you go to art school, everyone is white and middle class, you know, at least in the UK again. So, you know, things need to be done early on. And I'd like open schoolies to grow into this kind of school from age 0 to 100, maybe one day.
I think we finish the time we have. So, I mean, I think we have other questions, but maybe we can speak later outside this room. And thank you very much. And we will wait you next week for the public program of Toolist, our bar Toolist, the participants of our bar tool, on Saturday and Sunday from 6 to 9. So please come. You are very welcome. And thank you very much, Anna.
You're welcome. Thanks to you. Thanks everyone for questions that feed my thoughts.
Thanks.